When ancient bacteria nearly erased all life on Earth, the disaster didn't come from the sky, it came from the smallest living things on the planet. A new kind of microbe released oxygen, a gas that was harmless to them, but deadly to almost everything else. The oceans rusted, the atmosphere changed, temperatures collapsed, and Earth froze for millions of years. Nearly every species vanished, but that same gas, the one that caused so much destruction, also opened the door to complex life. Without that ancient mistake, you wouldn't be here to hear this story. If you could step back 2.5 billion years, you wouldn't recognize the planet beneath your feet. The sky wasn't blue, it shimmered with a hazy orange glow, thick with methane and carbon dioxide. The air would choke you instantly. No birds, no forests, no sounds of life. Just silence, broken only by the hiss of volcanic vents releasing clouds of sulfur. The stench of rotten eggs hung over a world still raw and unstable. The oceans weren't the deep blue mirrors we know today. They were green, thick, murky, and heavy with dissolved iron that had seeped from the planet's crust. Every wave carried the metallic taste of rust. And beneath those waves, life existed, not the kind you'd ever see with your eyes, but a microbial empire that had ruled Earth for billions of years. Sheets of slimy mats called stromatolites coated the shallows, built layer by layer by colonies of bacteria that trapped sediments as they grew. There were no predators, no prey, only microbes surviving on chemistry. Some devoured hydrogen and exhaled methane, wrapping the planet in a warm greenhouse blanket. Others feasted on sulfur or iron, thriving in the poisonous conditions. This was a world balanced on the edge, sustained by gases that would kill us instantly. And yet, to them, this world was paradise. The sun burned dimmer than today, almost a third less powerful, but that thick methane atmosphere kept Earth warm enough for liquid water. It was a fragile equilibrium, a living world running on alien metabolisms, oblivious that one small evolutionary accident would soon tear it all apart. Because somewhere, in a shallow pool shimmering under that orange sky, a new kind of microbe was about to appear, one that would invent the most dangerous trick in the history of life. It would split water and unleash a gas so toxic it nearly ended the world. Somewhere in those silent green oceans, among the endless mats of microbes feeding on sulfur and methane, a single lineage of bacteria stumbled upon an evolutionary miracle. It didn't roar into existence with explosions or fire. It began with light sunlight. These bacteria learned how to trap it. They already existed in many forms, purple and green sulfur bacteria that could photosynthesize, but only under rare conditions. They needed hydrogen sulfide from volcanic vents, or dissolved iron in just the right concentration. Their photosynthesis was fragile, tied to specific environments, but then came a new kind, cyanobacteria. They evolved something unprecedented. Photosystem 2, a complex molecular engine capable of doing the impossible. It could rip apart water molecules, stealing their electrons to fuel life. Water was everywhere, abundant, universal, limitless. For the first time, life had discovered a power source that would never run out. But there was a catch, a catastrophic one. Splitting water released a byproduct, a waste gas so reactive, so destructive. It was lethal to nearly everything else alive. That gas was oxygen. At first, it didn't matter. The oceans were filled with iron, and every atom of oxygen the cyanobacteria produced immediately reacted with it, forming rust that drifted down to the seafloor in great red clouds. For millions of years, this cycle repeated endlessly, oxygen forming, iron rusting, and the oceans slowly changing color from green to a cloudy red. What those microbes didn't know was that they were terraforming their own planet. Each breath of oxygen they released was transforming chemistry, reshaping air, sea, and sky, molecule by molecule, atom by atom. And when the iron finally ran out, there would be nothing left to stop it. Oxygen would no longer vanish into the oceans. It would escape into the air and turn the planet into a death trap for everything that had come before. The moment the last of the ocean's iron was consumed, Earth crossed a line it could never return from. The oxygen that had once been swallowed by chemical reactions now had nowhere to go. It began to collect, first in the water, then in the skies. It happened slowly at first, molecule by molecule, invisible to any living thing. But geologically speaking, it was an explosion. The seas that had been a murky olive green for billions of years began to change. Iron, the lifeblood of ancient bacteria, oxidized into rust and sank in colossal waves to the ocean floor. Layer after layer of red sediment built up across the planet, a planetary rusting event recorded forever in the rocks we call banded iron formations. They're still there today. Vast stripes of red and gray stretching across continents. Silent witnesses to the moment the world began to drown in oxygen. But the beauty of those red layers hides the horror beneath them. For most life at the time, oxygen was not a gift. It was death. It tore apart cell membranes. It warped DNA. It unleashed unstable radicals that shredded proteins like microscopic shrapnel. The planet's dominant life forms, the methanogens, sulfur breathers, and ancient chemotrophs, had no defense. They had never needed one. To them, this new air was poisoned. Across the oceans, entire microbial ecosystems collapsed. The once thriving slime worlds vanished. The methane blanket that had kept Earth warm was destroyed as oxygen reacted with it, turning it into carbon dioxide and water. Temperatures plummeted. Ice crept outward from the poles. Glaciers thickened, spreading across continents. The first global freeze in Earth's history began. The Huronian glaciation, a frozen apocalypse lasting hundreds of millions of years. And through it all, the tiny architects of the catastrophe, the cyanobacteria, kept on thriving, oblivious to the chaos they'd unleashed. They floated beneath the ice, bathed in dim blue light, still splitting water, still exhaling oxygen, still remaking the planet molecule by molecule. The Earth had turned red, frozen white, and choked with a gas that almost no life could survive. But out of this devastation, new possibilities were being written, quietly, invisibly, into the chemistry of life itself. Because the poison that killed a world would one day become the power that fueled every breath you take. The age of oxygen had begun, and for almost every living thing on Earth, it meant extinction, the gas that fills your lungs with life. Today once scoured the planet clean of nearly all existence. It was the first apocalypse in Earth's history, and it wasn't caused by fire, asteroids, or ice from space. It was caused by life itself. At first, oxygen seeped quietly into the oceans. But as the last chemical sinks, iron, methane, and sulfur were exhausted, the gas spread uncontrollably. It dissolved into the water, then escaped into the air. And when it did, it attacked everything it touched. Oxygen isn't passive. It's aggressive. It hunts electrons, ripping them away from molecules that once held cells together. Proteins twisted into useless knots. Membranes dissolved. DNA shattered like fragile glass. To a microbe that had never known oxygen. Even a breath of it was annihilation. The oceans turned into graveyards. Entire microbial civilizations, once covering every rock, every seafloor, every droplet of water, vanished. The warm methane blanket that had cocooned the planet was torn away as oxygen devoured the atmosphere's methane. And with that, the planet's temperature collapsed. For the first time in history, snow fell at the equator. Glaciers advanced from the poles, spreading mile after mile, reflecting sunlight into space. A feedback loop began. The colder it got, the more ice formed. The more ice formed, the colder it became. The Earth froze. This was the Huronian glaciation. A global deep freeze that may have lasted 300 million years. Some scientists believe it was the closest our planet ever came to becoming a complete snowball Earth. Under that frozen shell, most life perished, but not all. Beneath the ice, near volcanic vents, a handful of survivors clung to existence, primitive bacteria sheltered in pockets of warmth. Deep in sediments where oxygen could not reach, the rest of the planet lay silent, locked in ice and rust, waiting for evolution's next move, because the oxygen apocalypse hadn't just killed Dot, it had cleared the slate Dot, and in that frozen silence, evolution was about to write a new kind of life, one that wouldn't just endure oxygen, but master it. For hundreds of millions of years, the world remained locked in ice, but even in catastrophe, life finds a way. Beneath the frozen oceans, hidden in the warmth of volcanic vents and deep in the mud of oxygen-starved seafloors, survivors endured. They were the lucky few, microbes that carried accidental mutations, tiny advantages that would change the fate of every living thing to come. Some of these survivors evolved defenses against the new killer in the air. They built enzymes like superoxide dismutase and catalase, microscopic shields that could neutralize oxygen's molecular shrapnel before it shredded their cells. They didn't yet love oxygen. They merely learned how to tolerate it. But evolution never stops at tolerance-dotted experiments. It weaponizes. A handful of survivors took a step that would redefine biology forever. They learned to turn oxygen's destructive power into energy. Instead of fearing it, they began to use it. They evolved a new process called aerobic respiration, a biochemical symphony that used oxygen as the final electron. Except during a chain of reactions, the results were staggering. For billions of years, life had survived on primitive fermentation, a system so inefficient it yielded only 2 units of energy from each sugar molecule. But with oxygen in the mix, the yield exploded to 30-6. It was like switching from a candle to a nuclear reactor. Suddenly, cells could afford to grow larger, build stronger structures, and store more energy. Metabolism itself had evolved from a flickering chemical flame into a roaring furnace. The world was still cold, still hostile, still scarred by the oxygen apocalypse. But deep beneath the ice, the foundations of modern life were forming. Microscopic pioneers whose descendants would one day crawl, walk, and think. They had learned to breathe fire. And with that, the story of life entered a new age, one fueled by the very gas that once destroyed it. The world had been silent for so long that even time itself seemed frozen. The oceans lay locked, beneath sheets of ice kilometers thick. The skies were pale and thin, stripped of warmth. For hundreds of millions of years, Earth was a ghost planet, blue-white and still, but beneath the ice, life was stirring. Volcanoes erupted through the frozen crust, spilling out carbon dioxide and heat. As the greenhouse gases slowly rebuilt in the atmosphere, the planet began to thaw. Glaciers retreated. Oceans darkened. For the first time in eons, sunlight touched liquid water again. And in that fragile warmth, the survivors, the oxygen-tolerant microbes, flourished. They had endured the world's first mass extinction. And now they were poised to inherit an empty planet. Gone were the methane breathers and sulfur eaters that had ruled for billions of years. The Earth was theirs now, the world's first aerobes, organisms that didn't just survive oxygen. They needed it. With every breath, they transformed the planet further. Oxygen accumulated to new heights, painting the sky a soft blue and creating a thin shield of ozone that protected the surface from lethal ultraviolet light. For the first time, life could exist in sunlight without being burned away. And deep within this changing world, something even more extraordinary was happening. A larger cell, possibly an ancient archaean, engulfed one of these new oxygen-breathing bacteria. But instead of digesting it, it made a deal. The bacterium provided energy, and in return, the host cell offered protection. It was a fragile partnership, yet it would become the single most important collaboration in the history of life. That oxygen-breathing bacterium became the mitochondrion, the tiny power plant inside every cell of your body today, and with it, the door opened to a new chapter of existence, one of complexity, cooperation, and evolution beyond anything the world had ever seen. The Great Oxygen Catastrophe had ended, but in its wreckage, evolution had forged a new blueprint, one that would one day lead to plants, animals, and finally, us. The poison had become power. The apocalypse had become creation. The partnership between two ancient microbes, one large, one small, was not just an accident. It was evolution's greatest stroke of luck. The smaller cell, once a free-living bacterium, had mastered the deadly art of breathing oxygen. It could harness enormous amounts of energy from a single molecule of sugar. The larger host cell, on the other hand, was slow, clumsy, and desperate for more power. When it swallowed the bacterium, something extraordinary happened. Instead of digesting it, the two began to live together, one providing energy, the other protection. Over countless generations, this unlikely partnership stabilized. The bacterium gave up its independence, surrendering its genes and identity until it became a permanent resident inside its host. We call it mitochondria, the biological engine that powers every complex cell on Earth. With mitochondria generating vast energy, life could suddenly afford to dream bigger. Cells grew larger, more sophisticated, and began to specialize. Some became hunters, others builders. For the first time, cells could cooperate, dividing labor, sharing resources, and forming primitive colonies. This was the beginning of eukaryotic life, the foundation of everything multicellular that would ever exist. Every plant, every animal, every human traces its lineage back to this fragile alliance, the day two microbes chose cooperation over destruction. But with power came ambition. Once life learned to share energy, it began to build. Networks of cells became tissues. Tissues became organisms. And in the dark, oxygen-rich oceans, evolution began sketching the first blueprints for what we might one day call bodies. The frozen world was gone. The air was rich. The sea shimmered blue for the first time in history. And the planet, once nearly destroyed by oxygen, was now alive with its power. The apocalypse was over, and creation had begun. With mitochondria powering their cells, life entered a new era. For the first time, energy was abundant, so abundant that evolution could afford to experiment, no longer confined to microscopic simplicity. Organisms began to grow, connect, and specialize. Single cells formed loose colonies, tiny floating blobs of cooperation. Within these clusters, some cells started taking on unique roles. A few gathered nutrients. Others focused on movement or protection. These were the world's first teams. The first whisper of an idea that would one day build forests and cities. The idea that together, life could do more than it ever could alone. Over millions of years, these simple clusters became more structured. They began communicating through chemical signals, dividing labor with astonishing precision. Cells started to live and die. For the sake of the whole. It was a revolution of purpose. Individuality gave way to interdependence. The oceans became laboratories of creativity. With oxygen abundant, energy flowed like a current through every ecosystem. New forms of metabolism appeared. Organisms learned to use oxygen not only to survive but to thrive, to grow bones, shells, and tissues. Slowly, the first multicellular creatures emerged, soft-bodied organisms drifting through shallow seas, absorbing sunlight, filtering nutrients, and evolving ever more elaborate designs. For the first time in history, life could be seen. Creatures cast shadows in the water. Movement returned to the planet. The transformation was total. The same molecule that once wiped out nearly every living thing had now become the power source for complexity, diversity, and beauty. And yet, the story wasn't over, because oxygen would soon reached new heights, and with it would come the most dramatic explosion of life Earth had ever seen. The stage was set for evolution's grandest performance. The Cambrian explosion was coming, and life was about to paint the planet in color. By the time oxygen filled the skies and seas, Earth had become a different planet. The orange haze that once cloaked the world had cleared. The air turned blue. Sunlight, once deadly, was now filtered by a new shield, the ozone layer. Born from oxygen molecules high above, for the first time, life could safely reach toward the surface. Plants colonized the land. Animals followed, and the long silence of a microbial world gave way to the hum, cry, and heartbeat of a living planet. But beneath every forest, reef, and human breath lay the same invisible legacy. The oxygen that nearly killed everything. Every cell in your body, every heartbeat, every thought, depends on a process that began as a mistake. A waste product from tiny bacteria that never meant to change the world, yet their pollution became the fuel of evolution. The Great Oxygen Catastrophe wasn't just a mass extinction. It was the planet's first act of reinvention, the turning point that transformed death into opportunity. Without it, there would be no complex life, no mitochondria, no animals, no you. Every inhale you take carries the memory of that ancient apocalypse, the same gas that once shredded the DNA of almost every living thing is now what keeps you alive. When you breathe, you're participating in the same cycle that began 2.5 billion years ago, a cycle written in rust, ice, and survival. The sky is blue because of that catastrophe. The oceans are clear because of it. And the very thought forming in your mind right now, this moment of awareness, is powered by the same oxygen that once turned the Earth into a frozen grave. We don't just live after the apocalypse, we live because of it. The poison became power. The catastrophe became creation, and the world was reborn. When you look up at the sky and see its soft blue glow, you're looking at a side effect, the color of a planet that once nearly died. Every cloud, every breath, every heartbeat is part of that ancient chain reaction started by microscopic architects who never knew what they were doing. They didn't mean to destroy the world. They didn't mean to save it either. They just evolved a new way to survive. And somehow, in the chaos that followed, they built the foundation for everything that would ever live: forests, oceans, animals, and us. The story of oxygen is the story of transformation, how catastrophe becomes creation, how death makes room for life. And maybe that's the story of us too, because in every ending, there's the potential for something new, even if we can't see it yet. So next time you take a breath, remember, you're breathing in the same waste gas that once wiped out a planet, and exhaling the same life force that rebuilt it. If that doesn't make you feel small and alive at the same time, nothing will.